Seek Sustainable Japan. I'm JJWalsh in Hiroshima, Japan. And today I have the pleasure of talking with Stefan Ledoux, who is now in Tokyo, but he has just started a very exciting new sustainability focused consulting business in Fukuoka. Thank you so much for joining, Stefan.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm happy to be here today. I know we talked last year about inviting me for my previous position, and I couldn't make it, so I'm happy to be there today to explain what we're going to do with Codo.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Let's start with the name Codo. I love the name. There are 3 reasons that you chose the name Codo.
Yes,
Tell us the Japanese reason.
yes. So it's been a complicated debate to reach an agreement on the name because we have, Japanese colleagues in the project and more Western people such as me. So we had different expectations in terms of naming. And we came up with Codo because, so there's the Japanese meaning of Codo, which means action in Japanese. What we want to do with Codo is to explain and help Japanese companies realize that they need to act now on climate. They cannot just talk or wait or think, they need to act. So action is an important component. The other meanings of the name is in Western languages, co is for cooperation, collaboration is the idea of working together. So we want to establish I would say teamwork relationship with our clients. And there's also a third meaning in the sense that you can see the C and O of Codo as a C and a 0 for carbon zero. We want to focus on decarbonization. Climate change is the most pressing issue now, and the priority for corporate sustainability should be on climate action. So we wanted to have this carbon neutrality ID in the name. So that these are the different meanings hidden within the Codo advisory name.
Yeah, I love that idea of cooperation as well as Kodo in Japanese, meaning like momentum and movement, right? And then carbon in there as well. So you got 3 different meanings. I love that.
Exactly.
I'm showing your website right now.
Yes.
So you have your website is in English and Japanese, and you're
Yes.
also on Twitter and LinkedIn, right?
Yes, exactly. We want to position Codo as a bridge between Japan and the world. So from the beginning, I wanted that we communicate both in English and Japanese. I think some other consulting companies in Japan are very domestic, communicating only in Japanese, and it cuts them from, I would say, foreign partners or even foreign clients that could be interested in working on their activities in Japan. So we wanted to have this dual approach, and we have also LinkedIn in English and Twitter in Japanese, which shows the languages based on the, I would say, main populations on those 2 platforms.
Interesting. But you decided not to do French as well.
No, I could have done it technically, but I'm not sure the French audience is so large.
Right. But you're doing so many collaborations with Europe. So maybe
Yes.
your next step is to add a French version.
Why not?
Why not? You are so multilingual. So do you want to introduce your team?
Yes, sure. Just I have a small issue. I have still on my screen the chart of the decarbonization target of
No,
companies.
it's okay. I can
Okay.
see the website. Yeah.
Okay. So the team, our founder is. I see that someone is asking a French version.
Yeah, Fafa says,
Yes,
please
I
do
know.
a French version.
I know that
Wonderful.
person. Hello, Farid. So the team at Codo, our founder first is Okazawa-san. He's a former banker, Japanese guy, but he worked only in European banks. He finished his career at BNP Paribas, the French bank, last year. And he decided to graduate from BNP Paribas to start this project focusing on pushing Japanese companies to accelerate their climate efforts. because he worked outside of Japan and he saw as a Japanese citizen that there's a problem in Japan, that things are not moving fast enough compared to what's happening in Europe and other parts of the world. So, and the other thing he brought as a former banker is the understanding of the role of finance, that I can explain a bit later in the discussion. What we want to do is to use the pressure of finance on Japanese companies to help them understand that they need to accelerate. So this is our founder, Okazawa-san, and then my direct colleague is Suzuki-san from Amita. Amita is our partner company. Codo is a joint venture between a financial company, MCP, and an environmental company called Amita. So Suzuki-san is a Japanese working on circular economy at Amita for several years, and she also had extensive experience in Europe, in the UK, in Italy, etc. We also have one expert of decarbonization from Amita side as well, Shojima-san, and two junior research officers, Alexandra and Jeanne, who are interning with us, but actually part of the team and helping us deliver the services for our first clients and first partners. So we really have this, I would say, diverse team combining Japanese domestic talents and more foreign international expertise. We want, as I said, to be the bridge between Japan and the world, and to do that, we need that the team also is diverse and international.
Yeah, very important. We're going to talk about some of the motivations that you have designated as the ways that Japan businesses can transition a little bit easier for more sustainable practices or decarbonization. Should we jump right in? You ready?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, okay. So this first slide, you were talking about how investor influence, is that right?
Yes. This slide comes from a study from the UN Global Compact, which is the group of companies gathered by the UN to support the principle of the UN with a strong focus on sustainability since a few years. And this study was published at COP26 last year in Glasgow. And this chart shows that between 2016 on the left and 2021 on the right, the pressure felt by CEOs of companies in the world has changed. And in what we can see in dark blue is that the pressure from investors and shareholders was felt by 18% of CEOs in 2016. In 2021, 31% of CEOs declared that they feel the pressure from investors, from shareholders when it comes to the sustainability plans of the company. So it almost doubled in 5 years. The only other group that increased its level of pressure as felt by CEO is the first line, customers and consumers, from 55% to 72%. All the other groups, employees, governments, NGOs, etc., are going down. So we have these two groups, investors and shareholders, and customers and consumers, that have increased their influence on the sustainability agendas of big companies in the world. That's a message we want to highlight in Japan because, what happens concretely is that some investors now attack companies. They will attack the board. They will submit climate resolutions. It happened last year in the US. It's happening now in Europe. There's an example in France, for example, this month with Total Energy, attacked by some activist investors who want Total Energy to improve its climate plans. So they submitted a resolution and want it to be proposed to all shareholders for voting at the end of this month. So this is happening. Investors are pushing boards, are gathering other shareholders in those movements. And this is coming to Japan as well. There's an attempt from an NGO called Kiko Network, who joined forces with an Australian NGO called Market Forces. So they buy shares in companies, and then once they have shares, they are shareholders, so they are allowed to submit resolutions, and they are doing that on Japanese banks. So this is coming, and if the companies or the banks are not ready for that, if they don't have the arguments to explain that they have a plan to transition, to move from theoretical targets to concrete action, they will be at risk because they won't be able to reply to those attacks. So yeah, that's Kiko Network, Japanese NGO, very active on climate.
Yeah, they've come up a few times on this talk show. Different people have done projects with them. So this sounds like a great initiative that they're doing.
Yes. We need people like that who push Japanese companies, NGOs. So global NGOs are trying to do it as well. But I've been talking with some of them 2 or 3 years ago, and they told me that in Japan it's difficult for them, for those big NGOs like Greenpeace, WWF, etc., because they don't have as much support from the population as they have in other countries. Because, well, I think one issue of Japan is that most people are not much involved in environmental action, and the signals should come from the top, but they're not coming so much. So there's some kind of, I would say, immobilism, and we need signals, things to create that pressure and create the movement.
Yeah, I talked with an activist who was working with 350 org.
Yes.
And they were talking about defunding the Japanese banks that were funding the fossil fuel projects. Yes. And I know that's one of the things that you talk about. Recently, is it America now that the investors are asking companies to disclose about where the money is going and more transparency in terms of sustainability? Have you heard of this coming to Japan as well?
Yeah, so disclosure is a very big topic. I think that there are 3 things that shareholders, consumers, regulators are asking from companies now. First thing is more ambitious actions, better alignment with the Paris Agreement, and stronger targets. Something is more science, so no greenwashing. The targets should be accountable, they should be aligned with standards, etc. And the third thing is disclosure. You need to explain your impact on climate, past impact, current impact, future impact. You need to explain your plans, exactly that slide. And you need to explain your progress. So those 3 expectations are growing in the world. In some regions, like in Europe, it's becoming more and more regulated. So it's not something that companies can choose to do or not. In some sectors and some countries, they now have to do it. It's mandatory, and it's growing. And in the US, for example, there's this project of the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is basically the watchdog of the US trade exchange. And the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, is preparing new set of rules to make it mandatory for US listed companies to disclose their climate-related financial risks. So it's happening in the US. It's already the case in Europe with the EU taxonomy, the EU Green Taxonomy. There's also the TCFD framework, that is a framework initially coming from G20 ministers of finance, supported by the Financial Stability Board, which is the international board making sure that the global economy is not at risk of collapsing. And also it was supported by the former governor of the Bank of England, who is very, very much active on those topics. So TCFD is, I would say, at the moment, one of the main framework in terms of disclosure of climate-related risks to which companies are exposed. There are other tools like CDP, which is about disclosing your impact on climate and receiving a score from A to D. So all those tools are being developed and more implemented and more adopted by companies. It's happening in Japan as well. So both TCFD and CDP are now widely recognized by Japanese companies. The problem, I think, is that CDP and TCFD focus on disclosure of what's happening now. What is your impact now? What are your risks now? On the other hand, we have companies that set targets for 2030, 2040, 2050. We hear a lot about carbon zero 2050. It's kind of the standard that many companies align on. But between now and those targets in 20, 30 years, what happens? And that's the big question. And that's where a lot of greenwashing is happening, because if there's no plan, it means that between where you're now and where you go, there's no movement. There's no proof that you're going to do anything. And that's what we want to focus on with Codo. It's the action plan, the concrete action plan to transition from where you are now and where you want to be in 20, 30 years as a company. Yeah. This is the missing link. And it was a strong message at COP26 and other events recently. We need to move now from target setting to concrete action.
Yeah, so important. And one of the things you mentioned before we started was about how you really think change in Japan is going to come from abroad. And so when we're talking about transparency demand from investors in America, or when we're talking about other countries changing, this has a lot of pressure on Japan. Here you are talking about how Japan is so dependent on international markets, right?
Yes, exactly. Some Japanese companies may think that they are safe because they are domestic, they are in Japan on this set of islands, kind of protected from what's happening in the world, but it's false, because they all have exposure to international markets. Either they have foreign investors for listed companies, either they have plans or already export to foreign countries, either they are in supply chains of foreign companies. Sony, for example, is providing the sensors for the iPhones. Apple has very strong targets for carbon neutrality by 2030. It means that if Sony is not able to deliver carbon neutral sensors to Apple will need to find another provider for those sensors. So this is all connected via different connections, and Japanese companies cannot just stay following the only guidelines set by the Japanese government. This is not enough. They need to listen to what's happening outside of Japan, what companies in other countries are doing, what regulators in other countries are doing as well. If there are new taxes in Europe based on the carbon footprint on products, when you sell Shiseido cosmetics or Sony PlayStation or anything in Europe, you will have to take those taxes into account. And if your products produced in Japan have a high carbon content because the factories are using coal-produced electricity, you have a problem, because competitors from Europe will maybe have lower carbon footprint and then lower taxes. So this is all connected.
So and I have a fun example from Hiroshima. We have a famous okonomiyaki sauce. And I was talking to the Otafuku, one of the sales reps, and he said they are having to change their packaging because of export markets. Yes. That even on that level of having to change the amount of plastic that you use when you export, that is changing how they do business as a Japanese company. They also have a plant-based version of their sauce, but only for the export market. So yes. I say, please bring it here, because there are people who want it here, but they're changing faster because of the exports to other countries, which have higher standards for sustainability. So that's really good effect.
Yes, exactly. And that's something that I saw in different fields. I worked also on renewable energy, infrastructure developments, and I saw Japanese companies do more outside of Japan than in Japan on that. So you're totally right that Japanese companies seems to move faster outside of Japan because pressure from consumers is higher, maybe regulations are better to support.
Huge market, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And the demand from Japanese consumers, unfortunately, is not so high. The pressure is not so high. I had a slide on that. I don't know if you have it, where we see that it's a study that was done by JP Morgan Asset Management and PwC, showing that in 9 countries, including Japan was one of the lowest rate of people saying they agree with the sentence "I buy from companies conscious of protecting the environment." It's only 33% of Japanese people said that they buy from companies protecting the environment, while in Germany, yes, it's this one. It's 47%. Indonesia, China, it's much higher. So the level of agreement with this segment is lower in Japan. And what is striking also on this chart is that the level of disagreement is the highest in Japan. It means that 22% of Japanese people, according to that study, know they buy from companies that do not comply with environmental efforts. It's a conscious choice that they make to not buy from clean companies. It's actually a bit scary, I would say. And it probably explains why this Okonomiyaki sauce company has different packaging for European or other markets and Japan, because the level of expectation from consumers is very, very different. So it's moving, but not fast
And
enough.
when I talk to business owners and I make suggestions about changing in packaging or making more sustainable products here, they always say the number one thing they say is Japanese consumers don't care about that. And even a lot of like vegan options or more sustainable options we used to have in Japan, some small businesses, they stopped doing it when the inbound tourism stopped, because they said Japanese consumers don't care about that. It's so depressing, because I meet people all the time who do care, but maybe that's right, that the majority aren't really thinking about it yet.
Yes, I think there's a problem. I don't know the reason, but I think there's a problem of understanding of the need and the power that we have as individuals. Every time we buy something, it's like a vote. We vote for a product, so we can vote for a clean product or a dirty product. And maybe there's not as much in Japan as in Europe or in the US, this understanding that you have power as an individual to change society and to push at your small level with your vote and with your purchases. So maybe that's one reason. Maybe another reason is what we mentioned before, is that NGOs do not have the same visibility in Japan than in other parts of the world, and it's more difficult for them to get heard from the population and to educate and to raise awareness. I think one other problem is media. Media in Japan, I think, is not doing such a good work in terms of education to sustainability and asking the tricky questions to politicians, to companies. And I see a lot of articles in Nikkei or other respected newspaper that are actually greenwashing. When you read, you see that they explain the effort and they present the solution as a miracle solution, but it doesn't work. So I think the media should be more demanding and play a more aggressive role, I would say, like some journalists do in Europe, in the US, to push those topics.
And train your media staff to understand about the benefits for Japanese communities, the benefits for Japanese economy, if there is a drive towards sustainability. And I think that's really what's missing. There's still the idea here that's making sustainable change is too expensive, or it doesn't pay off, right?
Yes,
Frustrating.
yes.
This data was horrible, Stefan.
Yes, I know that chart is. I was shocked when I saw that. So, it's a study from PW Research Center on between 2015, the year of the Paris Agreement, and last year, 2021. The question was asked to people if they feel very concerned about the personal effects of climate change on their life and everything. And the only country where the level of concern has decreased is Japan. In all of the countries in this chart, Germany, UK, France, Spain, so for, I would say, European countries that already have this image of pushing for sustainability, but also in Australia, where public policies are not aligned at all with climate change and the government is not going in the right direction. Even in Australia, the population is more concerned now. In South Korea, which in some ways is following Japan path on many topics, with a few years of delay, the trend is also different. It's going up. Japan is the only country here where people are less concerned now than 6 years ago. So it's very concerning.
Oh, it's just so depressing. But I think this chart might give us some insight as to why the status quo and the same as usual approach is happening, right? Can you explain this one?
Yeah. So I was looking at some data to explain what can motivate Japanese companies to move, or what can prevent them from moving. And well, there are different things that can move a company. One is top management. If top management has a vision, has the willingness to change things, they can give an impulse from the top, and it will drive the company strategy towards a new direction. The problem and that we saw on this chart is that the average age of corporate presidents in Japan, CEO, chairman, etc., is going higher and higher every year. So in 1990, it was 54 years old, and it's now 59.7, so almost 60 years old. Of course, almost all of them are men. So we have basically only old guys at the top of the bigger Japanese companies. The average age of board directors for the top 200 companies in Japan is 66.8 years old. So again, very old top management on the board of directors. And only 6% of directors in the boards of Japanese companies are women, only 6%. In Europe or in the US, it's 25%. So it's not yet parity, but it's still much higher than in Japan. So we have only old guys holding the decision in those companies.
And there has been a change. Is it just this week happened that companies in Japan have to disclose how many women are in leadership positions, right? This is a new rule. But they should also have to disclose the ages. They should make it public how old all their leadership is, because one of the things that you contrast is the consumer awareness, the eco consumer is younger. The
Yes,
activists are young.
exactly. Yes,
And
yes.
if your governance, if your leadership is so gapped and so different generation from what the consumers want, that's not good for business, right?
Yes, exactly. What we know, and we see it happening in the world, is that the willingness to move and to change things more rapidly is coming from young people, and mainly women. Greta Thunberg is not an old guy. And so you just show a photo. I had a few photos that I found when I was looking for photos of protests, and we see that it's young women that are driving. So it's completely the opposite of what is in decision-making position in Japanese companies. So we need younger people, and we need more women in positions where they can have an influence on the decision made by the company on its strategy for sustainability. And this is not happening yet in Japan, unfortunately.
Well, if all of your leadership is of a very different generation, it's very hard to make those changes, right?
Yes.
Let's talk about greenwashing.
Yes.
Greenwashing is such an important big issue, and something that I'm sure you're trying to deal with when you consult with clients and trying to
Yes.
make sure they are very transparent and honest and open about what they're doing and what they're trying to do and what they still need to do, right? So it's
Yes.
not greenwashing.
Yes, exactly. So greenwashing has been going on since, I would say, the pressure has been increasing on companies to be more aligned with what is required for the environment. Greenwashing is techniques that companies use to pretend they're acting, but actually they're not doing enough or fast enough or not ambitious enough. So it's something they use to, I would say, to buy time and to keep business as usual as long as possible, without changing the products, without changing how the factories are powered, without changing the way they transport the products, etc. But this is less and less effective, because the level of education of consumers in some countries, the level of education of investors, the level of or the limits set by regulations are all increasing and making it more and more difficult to greenwash. For example, in the EU now, if you want to label a financial product as green, you have to give proofs that it's actually supporting green activities. If it's not, the regulators can ask you to drop your green credential and just label your bond as a bond, but not a green bond. So this is happening at regulation level. It is happening also, as you was visible on the slide that you just show, by attacks, either from shareholders. So we have here the example in June 2021 in the US with ExxonMobil, big oil and gas group that was attacked by an activist investor called Engine Number One. Engine Number One had only 1 out of 5,000 in terms of shares of ExxonMobil. It's tiny. They only had one of, they are 5,000 times smaller than the market capitalization of ExxonMobil, and still they managed to run a campaign to get enough support from other shareholders to push three directors of the board of ExxonMobil out and put their own candidates more aligned with the expectations in terms of climate strategy of ExxonMobil. So this happened in
That's
June last year.
amazing. Yeah.
Yes. And in a way, it's what we talked earlier with Kiko Network and market forces on Japanese banks is happening now. It's not yet to the level of what happened in the US with directors of the board that are invited to go out, but this is moving. We also have local governments attacking, like the city of New York, who attacked some oil and gas companies, ExxonMobil again, and I think BP and Shell, because the city of New York considered that those companies were deceiving New Yorkers, citizens of New York. So the city is acting to protect the citizens against greenwashing. So stories like that, there are more and more of attacks from investors, from NGOs, from local governments, from regulators against greenwashing. It was also a strong message at COP26 last year. Even the UN Secretary General said that we need to stop greenwashing. The UN will, from this year, 2022, start to be more active on that and implement some measures to make it more difficult for companies to greenwash. So we want to push that message in Japan as well.
That's so important. I always, if I ever talk to any companies, and I always, if as a consumer, if I ever see any package that I think is greenwashing, or maybe it's true, I always make sure to ask the staff and find out and then research. And I think the young consumer who is sustainability motivated, they are good researchers. And
Yes.
they will find out if it's true or not. And if it's not true, watch out, because they are
Yes.
going to not only are they not going to buy your product, but they're going to tell everybody on social media
Exactly.
not to buy your product. So it's dangerous to greenwash now, I think.
Yes, it's a risk. There are many risks to which Japanese companies, but including Japanese companies, are exposed if they do not align with climate in a more honest way without greenwashing. And one is exactly that one that you mentioned. It's a reputational risk. If you are not good enough, or if you pretend that you're good but you're not, and people realize, then you will have a negative impact on your reputation, and it will be very difficult to reestablish that reputation, especially if the population and the customers are demanding, and if the media is playing their role. So that's where we still have some work to do in Japan, because even if there's an issue of greenwashing, it's unlikely that it will be headlines in the media, but I think it will be coming. And as you said, younger generation is more demanding on that. What we could hope to see more developed in Japan is solutions to make it easier for consumers to understand what they buy. There are some apps in Europe, for example, in France, there's an app that you can use to scan the barcode of a product in a supermarket, and you have all the data, environmental data, showing on your phone. So even if it's not displayed by the company that makes the product, you can have the information on your phone thanks to this app. So I would like to see that kind of app developed in Japan to make it easier for consumers when they are buying to understand what they do, because it's not always on the label.
No, it's often hidden. I'll give you a really easy example. There's a wonderful group on Facebook, and they have their own website. They're very active, called Is It Vegan? And people are always checking Japanese products with, is it vegan? Is this really vegan? And the most surprising one I saw was almond milk. Now, almond milk, and they had like a very technical scientific name, which ended up being from animals, from pigs. And you wouldn't expect almond milk not to be vegan, right? And so everybody on this group, and there's thousands of people following this group, were now never going to buy that brand, not just that product, right? So being transparent is such a key part of having loyal customers and being successful going forward, I imagine.
Yes. I heard in an event maybe 2 months ago that it's becoming more and more difficult to bullshit. So regulators, consumers, they are more educated now than 5 years, 10 years ago. And you can buy time, you can try to keep greenwashing, but it will not last forever. And the later you move into a new mindset where you actually transform your business to a more sustainable model, the later you do that, the more at risk you are, because all your competitors will already have moved. Maybe your consumers will have moved to other products. And if you move too late, potentially you're dead as a company. Also because you keep investing in production capacity that is not sustainable, using, I don't know, coal for your power production, or transportation solutions that are not clean. So the more you wait, the more expensive it will be, and the more dangerous it will be for your company to actually do that transformation that you will have to do at some point. It's like when Kodak tried to resist digital photography. So Kodak was like, no, it's okay, we can keep doing analog.
Or how Toyota was resisting electric cars for a long time. Eventually, they realized the trend is there. They have to change. One of the interesting things I think about your business is how you help businesses transition. So your theory, your philosophy is educate, empower, engage. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yes. So we are very proud of these 3 E's: educate, empower, and engage. We found that, and it's also the E of environment. What we wanted to have is, I would say, a catalog of services that can be seen like a journey, starting from scratch. So we imagine that some companies that don't really know what's happening in the world in terms of corporate decarbonization trends, what I explained about what investors, regulators are doing in other parts of the world. So that's the educate component. We explain to Japanese companies what's happening, what are the risks if they don't move, if they don't listen to what's happening, and help them realize that there's this need. So it's the education part. Then once they've realized that there's something to do, or maybe they already knew but they don't know how to do it, it's the second part. It's empower. We will help Japanese companies improve their transition strategy using a methodology that's been developed in Europe called ACT. So ACT is really focused on the transition strategy between the disclosure of what you're doing now, that we mentioned before, with standards like CDP, TCFD, and the long-term target. ACT and the transition strategy is the concrete roadmap and how you will move year after year towards your target. So we will help Japanese companies establish those transition strategies and also improve the way they communicate towards investors, and especially foreign investors, about those strategies. It's the integrated report or ESG reports that big companies have to publish for their investors. And again, there's a lot of greenwashing going in those documents. Sometimes I think Japanese companies do not realize that they are greenwashing. They just repeat what the Japanese government is saying, and they think it's okay. But actually, it's not okay, because it's not aligned with what we expect in other parts of the world and what investors in Europe or in the US are expecting. So I think there's maybe some kind of naive approach of that by some Japanese companies that I think they're okay because they just follow the regulations of Japan. But because the regulation and policies of Japan are not ambitious enough and not aligned with what Japan should be doing for the Paris Agreement, it's actually not okay. So it's still greenwashing. Even if you're okay with the regulation in your country, it's not okay for the rest of the world. So we want to help also companies on that and better explain their plans with more transparency and more credibility when they are read by foreign investors. And the third component of the educate, empower, engage pillar is the interface, the dialogue between Japanese companies and investors, especially foreign investors. So on that, we can help, for example, foreign investors to understand the quality or the readiness of Japanese companies in their portfolio. There are investors in Europe, in the US, that hold shares in Chinese companies, and they may at some point want to see if those companies are at risk or not because of good or not good climate plans. So we can provide that service to investors. And also we plan to organize workshops where we gather the two sides of this dialogue, investors from abroad and Japanese companies, to help them better understand each other and establish that active dialogue and break that kind of barrier that exists sometimes between Japan and the rest of the world. So it's really the idea of bridge that I mentioned several times that is important for us. We want to break that kind of insulation that some Japanese companies have established around themselves, or that maybe sometimes Japanese regulations establish. This is moving, by the way, because Tokyo Stock Exchange from this year is making it mandatory for the top Japanese companies to disclose more information in English. So far, Japanese companies could decide to do it or not, but now it's becoming mandatory. It's not only on climate, it's disclosure of information for investors, but it includes information about your climate plans and sustainability plans. So regulations are also starting to push companies in Japan as well on that.
So interesting. Now you have a good background for doing the bridge between Europe and Japan. You were working for organization with Japan and Europe organization, SPIPA, is that right?
Yes. So SPIPA was the name of the project for strategic partnership for the implementation of the Paris Agreement, SPIPA. And it was a project funded by the EU to promote the Paris Agreement and its actual implementation in various countries, including Japan. So I was in charge of implementing the Japanese component. So for that project, I was working at the EU-Japan Center for Industrial Cooperation, which is an entity funded by the Japanese ministry, METI, Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry of Japan, and the European Commission. It's a joint non-profit organization. So I was in charge of that project, SPIPA. The focus was concrete climate action in cooperation between Japanese and European partners, mainly companies, but also local governments. So we had a series of events in 2020, 2021 on renewable energy like offshore wind, green hydrogen, clean transportation, the role of local ecosystems for decarbonization, etc. So we gathered quite significant audience throughout the series of events with speakers from both sides. It was very interesting. It also confirmed something that I already knew, because before that I was working in the French embassy on similar topics, and I already saw at that time that Japan and Europe can work together on that, and they can work more on that. There are some good complementarities in terms of technologies. Europe is, I would say, a bit more advanced now on most public policies and therefore technologies, because companies will align technologies with public policies. So there are some experience that Japan can use from European players in offshore wind, for example, where Japan is trying to accelerate now. We have a significant experience in Europe that Japan could use more to make it easier to deploy at lower cost. On hydrogen, you mentioned Toyota. So Toyota does cars, does bus using hydrogen. In Europe, we have companies who know how to produce green hydrogen, so they can work together to have the full value chain from production to the end use in the car of real clean mobility using hydrogen. So there are many.
This is a big concern for a lot of people about hydrogen in Japan. Is it really going to be made with clean renewable energy? Because it's very energy intensive to make hydrogen. Hydrogen in use is wonderful and clean, and it's very efficient. You can run your cars and trains and even airplanes maybe on hydrogen. But how you make hydrogen is really important. So this must have been a really good discussion.
Yes. And I saw in the organization of that event that the European vision of hydrogen and Japanese vision of hydrogen were different. As you mentioned, it's important to consider how hydrogen is produced. And there's sometimes a misconception that hydrogen is clean. But it's the same as saying that electricity is clean. It doesn't mean anything. If electricity is produced with coal, it's not clean. If it's produced with offshore wind or solar, it's clean. It's exactly the same for hydrogen. And in Europe, we have a clear vision that hydrogen should be green. It should be produced from renewable sources. It's the main pillar of the European Union's hydrogen policy. It's green hydrogen. In Japan, it's not yet so much connected. There is the idea of developing hydrogen in Japan because it's clean where you use it. So in the car or in your house, there's no emission of CO2. That's true. But at the source where you produce the hydrogen, there may be some emissions if you produce it using coal, like some Japanese companies are doing now in Australia. So it's clean in Japan, but it's not clean in Australia, and that's the problem. And it's a very good illustration of what we mentioned before of greenwashing, because if you don't explain how you produce your hydrogen and still say that it's clean, it can be greenwashing, because if you don't prove that it's green hydrogen, well, it's not really clean. And it's also a good example of the level of I would say lower awareness or expectation of the Japanese press. I read a lot of articles in Japanese newspaper where hydrogen is introduced as a clean energy source, but it's not a source of energy. It's just a vector that you use to transport coal, solar, wind. That is the primary source of energy. And journalists don't make that link, and they just promote hydrogen because also it's part of, I would say, kind of Japanese industrial policy supported by the government and big players. But it's a very good example of what we discussed before, of the risk of greenwashing and the level of education.
Yeah, it's one to watch, I think, to watch and keep reading about and keep checking and keep asking about. One kind of recent development is about renewable energy in Japan. So with wind, offshore wind or solar, you talked about eco cities, clusters and regions. Recently, I was contacted by Shizen Denka. We have solar on our house, but it's not enough. So we also source from Shizen Denka. They just contacted us saying they're going out of business at the end of the year, and please transfer to another electric company. And I was so sad. Of course, I can transfer to another renewable resource company, but this should not be happening. Yes. Any renewable energy company in Japan should be thriving. What's happening? Do you know, Stefan?
Well, there are a lot of factors and things happening since 1-2 years in the energy market globally. So there's a lot of movement, and it's very complicated to predict what's going to happen. And even some companies in the renewable energy sector in other countries are sometimes having difficulties. I think there's a lot of regulations, complicated mechanisms that sometimes will index the price of renewable energy with the price of fossil fuels, even if it doesn't make sense. There are some mechanisms like that will make it difficult to have a sustainable business, even though you are selling clean energy that is not produced from fossil fuels with volatile prices. So that's one thing. One other thing I think is the lower demand. As we mentioned before, consumers, unfortunately, in Japan are not as demanding of clean products, including clean energy, as in other parts of the world. I moved 3 times in Japan. I changed house 3 times, and never, when I visited the house, the owner asked me, "Do you want that supplier for your power or that other one?" It was always TEPCO. The question was never asked. I had to ask, and for this house that I have now, I asked, "I want Minna del Nyoku, I want renewable energy." But if I don't ask the question as the tenant of the house, no one will ask. And again, I think it's a matter of understanding of people, owner or people who rent, but also a matter of regulations. Again, to use an example from France, in France, you cannot rent as a owner, you cannot rent your home, your apartment to anyone if you don't do energy efficiency diagnosis and give the paper to the person who is going to rent or buy your apartment or your house. It's impossible to be not transparent. You have to do it. It's mandatory by law. It doesn't exist in Japan. So you can get into a house that has zero insulation, that maybe cannot be connected to a supplier of renewable energy, and you don't know, because no one tells you. There's no regulation to protect you, and maybe you realize 6 months, one year later, but it's too late because you're there and you cannot change.
So yeah, this is where regulation really helps, right? And you were talking about the positive influence of regulation pressure.
Yes.
Do you want to
Yes.
explain about this a little bit?
Yes. So maybe I'm a bit biased on that because I used to work for the French Ministry of Ecology, Energy, Transport. So I used to work on public policies, and I tend to think that public policies have a strong influence in what's happening. The example that we have on this slide is carbon markets. So basically, carbon market is something that a regulator can set at the level of a country, or in the case of the European Union, at the level of the 27 countries of the European Union, where the regulator will give to each company a certain level of emissions of carbon that they are allowed to do each year. They have quota. And at the end of the year, if the company has emitted more than their quota, they need to buy carbon credits. And if they have emitted less, they can sell their carbon credits. So that's why we call that a market. And the price of the credits will go up if more companies have emitted more than what they can do, and will go down if companies have emitted less. And also each year, the regulator can decide to reduce the quota, so gradually driving down and making it more and more difficult for companies to to keep emitting above what they are supposed to, because the price of the credits will increase. So we have that tool in Europe since now more than 15 years. There has been some mishaps and difficulties at the beginning because it was new and it was difficult to launch this very ambitious and complicated tool, but now it's working. It's been set up in California, in the US. It's been set up in South Korea, but it doesn't exist in Japan yet. I've been hearing a lot the Ministry of Environment, the Ministry of Economy discussing about that since, I would say, 5 years. The Ministry of Environment, which is more pushy on climate, I think is more in favor of this kind of tools. But the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry listens more maybe to companies, and companies don't want that because basically it's a new source of pressure for them and possibly new costs if they emit more than their quota. So there's this resistance from the government to set up that, but it's recognized globally that it's one of the most efficient tool to drive companies to decarbonize, because you don't impose any technology, you don't impose any solution, you just put a price on carbon and then companies will adapt. It's some kind of natural selection. If they don't adapt, they will have to pay more and more to buy the credits from companies that have done the effort and that have credits to sell. So it's really market-based tool. Companies are used to market-based tools. And it doesn't exist in Japan yet. There's some voluntary kind of system being discussed now, but if it's only voluntary, it doesn't have the impact that it can have if it's mandatory and for everyone. And even China has that since 1 year now.
Yeah. So regulation is important. Consumer awareness and consumers engaging with the company and the product and asking questions is important. The company having good leadership that is thinking about the long term is important. Stefan, we have only a couple more minutes. What do you think is the number one thing you would advise businesses in Japan to start focusing on to make the sustainable transition?
In terms of concrete action, so without talking about plans or target setting or anything, I think the most impactful thing that a company can do to improve its sustainability is thinking about their energy consumption. So reduce energy consumption, energy efficiency, but it's something that many Japanese companies did already in the 90s. So the level of energy efficiency in companies may be already good. It's not the case in housing, but in industry maybe. The other thing is decarbonize the mix. So instead of buying your power from a supplier that use coal or fossil fuels, move to suppliers that use more renewable energy. And it will also support the development of a stronger renewable energy market, Japan, and help drive the offer by a stronger demand. And I think that's the number one action, because it's where most of the emissions come for individuals, but also for companies.
That's a great answer. Good job.
Thank
I
you.
love it. We have a question from Azizi-san on LinkedIn. Hi, Stefan and Joy. Does Australia ever feature in your discussions in Europe?
Australia, yes. Well, what I see happening in Australia is that government is not really active yet on climate, and I would say in that way is a bit aligned with the Japanese government. So kind of the not so good pupils in the classroom, a bit lagging behind, and keep supporting coal and those kind of energy. But when we look at other stakeholders, like private companies, there's some things happening in Australia, and it's one of the parts of the countries where there's a lot of startups developing clean technologies with a level of interest from investors that is increasing, but not yet the public policies to support that and make the transition more active and more ambitious. So I think that's something that Australia could do if the Australian government switched its mindset and would move to the side of the climate active governments, like governments in Europe, now in the US with the end of the Trump era and Joe Biden back on the press segment.
Yeah, I've seen so much exciting innovation and grassroots movement, a lot of young startups in Australia. So I think, like you said, the government regulation right now is lacking. It's not very proactive and forward thinking. But Ocean Impact Organization is always doing startup challenges. There's a lot of great enthusiasm coming from Australia. So let's not give up hope for Australia. I think change is on the horizon.
Yes. And it's important for Japan, because Japan and Australia can work together on that. They work already on hydrogen supply chain, sometimes with coal, as I mentioned, but there are also some projects to produce clean hydrogen with renewable energy in Australia with their space and import it to Japan to be used in Japan, and it will be really clean. There's also the example that I mentioned earlier of Market Forces, which is an Australian NGO working with Kiko Network to push Japanese banks on climate. So there can be more talk between Japan and Australia, even without the governments. Companies to companies, NGOs to NGOs can already work together to start that dynamic until the governments also are embarked in that movement.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, that is our time, Stefan. So
Thank
many
you.
great insights and ideas there. I would encourage anyone watching, if you're interested in what Stefan is doing, have a look at their wonderful website, which I've added the link below, and reach out to Stefan on LinkedIn as well, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Joy.
Thanks, everyone, for joining. Have a
Thank you,
great
everyone.
night. Take care.
Goodbye.